DeWitt is a 501c6 nonprofit that was started in 1997, encompassing 138 city blocks, and it's really DC's region's main employment hub. We serve our members through capital improvement, resources and research, as well as promoting public-private partnership. You may also know that we traditionally host the State of Downtown Forum in a live setting, and we're planning to do that again this year in an event that would have been held at the Woolly Mammoth Theater. But obviously the arrival of the coronavirus pandemic in March, followed by subsequent business closures and stay-at-home orders, require that we pause. While we cannot deny the review of historical performance is an important practice in working to chart a course for the future, we also cannot deny that the state of downtown, the DC region, and quite frankly, the world look entirely different a few months ago. And so our state of downtown is going to be different this year. So with that in mind, today's forum has been structured to include a brief look back at our 2019 performance. Then we'll focus primarily on where we are, where we're going, ideas on how to get there while rebuilding downtown DC's economy on a foundation of health, equity, and opportunity. If you have questions or comments or suggestions during the forum, please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll address as many as we can. Now, let's welcome Chairman Phil Mendelson, who is the chair of the City Council in Washington, D.C. Phil was first elected in 1988 to the DC City Council, just 1 year after the downtown bid was formed. Chairman Mendelson will provide some opening remarks. Welcome, Chairman Mendelson.
Thank you, Neil, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I remember when legislation to establish the bids was first proposed in the mid-1990s. I wasn't quite elected, but I remember that it was very controversial, which is a little hard to understand today. I find the bids to be critical to the vitality of our commercial neighborhoods. Throughout the years, the downtown bid has helped revive our downtown core through basic services, infrastructure projects, and economic development strategies. This, in turn, has brought tens of thousands of visitors to DC, and many of the bids have worked to solve some of our social problems, for instance, connecting our most vulnerable residents to homeless population to critical services. So I thank you for all that you do. Today, my message to you is that I hope you and all of you will continue to engage with the council and the mayor as we chart a path back to normal. This public health crisis is without precedent. For the sake of people's health and well-being, thousands of businesses in the district have been closed for over 2 months. In 1 month, private sector employment contracted by 11.9%, wiping out 8 years of job growth. The council and the mayor have worked well together over the last couple of months, and we have worked to help businesses through this crisis. For example, creating a small business micro-grant program, deferring real property tax payments short-term by hotels, delaying short-term the payment of sales taxes for some businesses, capping commissions restaurants were paying to third-party delivery apps like Grubhub and DoorDash, and requiring property owners to work with their commercial retail tenants to create rent payment plans. In addition, the mayor has proposed a budget that is now before the council that maintains the city's strong financial position. Our chief financial officer, Jeff DeWitt, has estimated that our revenues have declined by $721 million this fiscal year, of which there are only a few months left, and will decline $773 million in fiscal year 2021, which begins this October 1st. These are declines in revenue from the previous revenue estimates that had been made only in February. To address these revenue shortfalls, the mayor is proposing using a significant portion of our budget reserves, as well as last year's budget surplus, in addition to making cuts in agency budgets. This approach will help us maintain a solid credit rating and keep critical services operating without the need to generate additional revenue through tax increases. As the council works through this budget, we will hear calls, already we are hearing the calls, for us to do more, to raise taxes for this program or find additional revenues for that program. The long knives are out. But in my view, we must be careful not to increase burdens on district residents or businesses at a time when so many are facing an uncertain future. We know the road to recovery is long and unclear. I know that there may be more that we can do as a government to support businesses in the district during this crisis. So I hope that the downtown bid and all of you continue to engage with the council to provide us with your ideas on how we can help and to provide input on ideas that we bring forward. It is through this kind of collaborative process that we can get back to normal. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to give welcoming remarks. I'm going to have to leave at 3 p.m., but I am interested in as much of the program as you get in. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chairman Mendelson, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. As I mentioned at the top of the program, we will provide a very high-level highlight on the 2019 State of Downtown Report. You can refer to our website, downtowndc.org, for a full copy of the report. And if you're like Matt Klein, you'll probably read it from cover to cover. For newcomers to the State of Downtown Forum, the DC economy is a collection, the Downtown DC economy is a collection of economic sectors that the BID collects data on to analyze its economic performance on an absolute basis compared to the rest of DC, and then compared to the region and compared to other large cities in the nation. And so we're going to go through just quickly 6 slides, if we can tee the slides up. So everybody knows the geography of downtown DC, so we can move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, it was overall a below average year in DC. It's probably the first time since the Great Recession that we had a below average performance year. A few sectors had above average operating performance, so some had average and several below average. These rankings involve a judgment as there is a varied performance in each sector. So for example, the museum sector had a below average year as the Spy Museum moved to Southwest and the museum closed. But the National Portrait Gallery had its second best year ever due to the continued popularity of the Obama portraits. The National Museum of Women in the Arts had a record attendance also. Next slide. So in addition to the good news about the Portrait Gallery and the Women's Museum, there was some additional good news. The office market is the 4th strongest in the nation after New York City, San Francisco, and Boston. The downtown hotel market is the 4th strongest in the nation after New York City, Boston, and San Francisco, in that order. The occupied private office space was at 98% in 2019, which is a high of approximately 48.7 million square feet, and approximately a dozen restaurants earned Michelin, James Beard, or Rammy recognition. Next slide. We were very pleased to welcome in 2019 Apple and Tiffany and Company stores. We had 13 new restaurants planned as of February of this year, over $2.3 billion in future development plan, and something that we're very proud of, we opened the Downtown Day Services Center to serve people experiencing homelessness on the streets of downtown DC. Next slide. So the downtown bid likes to say that the city is the neighborhoods and downtown, not the neighborhoods or downtown. It sounds like Mayor Bowser saying we are all in this together. It's because it's the same philosophy that we have here. The only way to move forward is with everyone working together. So in addition to the jobs and activities that downtown DC provides to the residents and businesses of the city, the bid area marks a huge annual fiscal contribution to the city every year, as the tax and other government revenues that are generated in downtown DC far exceed the cost of government services needed in downtown DC, which is what we call the net fiscal impact. So it helps fund the city's robust and important progressive social agenda. Next slide. So only 3 sectors of downtown DC economy are open today, and only partially. So essential retailers, only 27% of them are open. Some hotels, only 46% of hotel beds are open. And some restaurants, about 59%, are providing takeout and delivery service only. Overall, while open, retailers are only operating at 50% of sales, hotels at 10%, and restaurants at about 20% of sales. Next slide, and our final slide. So the graph, you probably have to peer real closely to follow, but this graph is showing the economic performance over time. The orange line at the bottom shows the overall DC economy's level of activity as a percentage of the capacity. And as of May 12th, it was at a very low 9% of capacity. The other lines track 3 partially open sectors of the downtown economy highlighted in the previous slides. So if you have walked or biked or driven through downtown DC recently, you can feel the lack of activity all around you. The bid looks forward to helping drive the recovery forward as downtown DC and the economy is open. So please read our full report at downtowndc.org. Now, I'd like to introduce our next 2 speakers. You can read their titles and places of employment on the slides. First is Jeannette Chapman, who is the director of the Stephen S. Fuller Institute at George Mason University. She's a former Downtown Bid alum. And she will provide broader context on the downtown DC and DC economy. Then we'll be joined by our esteemed moderator, and this afternoon, who's Peter Abrams, publisher of the Washington Business Journal, who will introduce our esteemed panelists. So Jeannette, the screen is yours.
Great. So I am going to start with a very brief reminder about where we were prior to the pandemic on that first slide. So the U.S. was in the longest business expansion on record, with data going back to 1854. The Washington region's business expansion had not lasted that long because we had a minor recession in 2013 and 2014. You can see in this chart, our job growth rate decreased significantly in 2014. This is primarily because of sequestration. And in the past 5 years, we've had fairly average growth. This is in line with national patterns. However, in a business expansion climate, average growth is an underperformance, and the Washington region overall really had middling growth compared to our peer metros as well. And it wasn't until the end of 2019 and early 2020 that job growth began to pick back up. The next slide shows what happens after that. The pandemic hit. So you can see in January and in February, the Washington region's job growth on a percentage basis compared to the prior year was outperforming the other large metros, which we consider our peer metros, and other places in the US. That outperformance continued somewhat in March. However, growth in the region decreased by about 40% because of the pandemic. The jobs data are measured as of essentially the middle of each month. And so this only reflects the first few weeks of the pandemic. And we fast forward into April. As of mid-April, the Washington region had lost 9% of its jobs compared to April of 2019. This job loss is a little bit milder than our other peer metros and the US overall. And the relative improvement in job loss is the result of our underlying industrial composition, our reliance on our knowledge workers and the types of businesses that we have here, more so than the presence of the federal government alone, although that's part of it. But it also does reflect the overarching types of services that we provide here. The Washington region does provide management services and other services that are required in order for things to move forward. The next slide shows what happened in the District of Columbia. Of the DC job market lost around 63,000 jobs in that 12-month period, or 7.8%. The largest industry in the District of Columbia, as measured by jobs, is the federal government. The federal government increase that you see on this slide is primarily because of temporary decennial census workers. So really think about that as a temporary bump up. And in general, the federal government activity has been flat. The second largest sector in DC is the professional and business service sector. This sector significantly outperformed the US overall, even though it had some mild losses. In the US, this sector lost about 9% of its jobs, primarily concentrated in administrative and temporary service jobs. In the District of Columbia, this 0.4% loss is very mild, and it does represent does reflect the somewhat resilient underlying revenue streams for our high value add technical workers. Now, on the flip side, the sector that had the largest decreases was the leisure and hospitality industry. This is not surprising. Nationally, about half of all jobs in this sector were not on payroll as of April 2020, as the middle of April 2021. The loss in DC was a little bit larger, around 58%, and this again is mostly because there are a higher share of restaurant jobs in this industry mix in the District of Columbia compared to the US overall. But in general, this decrease is in line with what happened nationally. And when we think about the benefit of the underlying industrial composition for DC and the Washington region, unlike other recessions that are caused by business cycle changes, our economy is less immune from the current health crisis. And so while we do benefit from being of the capital region and from having a large share of knowledge-based workers, on an individual sector level, like the leisure and hospitality sector, it is still having significant decreases because of the health crisis. The demand here is changing not because of underlying income patterns, like in normal business cycles, it is changing because of the health crisis. So the next slide shows one example about how the demand changed, and we can actually extrapolate a little bit about what we can think about as we reopen. This chart shows the open table reservations on a daily basis for in-restaurant dining. Demand in both the District of Columbia and in the US overall decreased precipitously in March prior to any official shutdown or implemented strategies to on a policy level. Yeah, as of March 15th, prior to the District of Columbia's official shutting down of this industry or the in-restaurant dining component, demand had dropped off by 55%, and this is exclusively in response to the health crisis. Consumers changed their demand patterns based off of what they deemed safe. And you can see the US has started to reopen, or other places in the US have started to reopen, and that demand hasn't returned with any noticeable effect because the health crisis is still a problem. So people won't go back to restaurants and they won't return to normal shopping behaviors until the health crisis has abated. And when we think about as we start to reopen, the next slide shows two potential paths for our economy overall. These are on an annual basis, and so they look a little bit sharper than if I were to spread this out on a monthly basis. But we know that given what's happened already, the economic contraction for the Washington region in 2020 will be between 5.3 and 6%. And there's a minor difference in this path because of differing assumptions about what will happen with consumer confidence going forward, not just the health, but beyond the health benchmarks. If people feel a little bit more uncomfortable, they will have a delayed spending pattern. They will stay home longer. As we reopen, though, the thing to remember is that the reopening will coincide with only a very modest increase in demand, because the health crisis is going to determine how people how people spend their time, what they think is safe, what they think isn't safe, and so that the phased reopening will only result in modest incremental increases in demand. This type of reopening, the slow and steady reopening of the economy, will continue in this forecast through the summer of 2021, which is sort of the arbitrary decision as to when, for this set of assumptions, when we would get a vaccine. But even with the vaccine, the full economic recovery would not happen until 2022 in both of these scenarios. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Neil.
Thank you so much, Jeannette, for that overview. I'm actually going to hand it straight over to Peter Abrams from the Washington Business Journal.
Well, thanks very much, Neil. And first of all, I want to thank everyone. We've got quite a crew today joining us, so very appreciative that everyone took the time. I just wanted, before I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to give you a few rules or things that you should be paying attention to. At the very bottom of the screen, you'll notice that there is a Q&A box. We already have a few of our attendees who have found that, but please feel free to post your questions there. It's unlikely that we'll get to all of the questions, but we do want to make sure we respond, and we'll leave time at the end. We have about 45 minutes for the panel. I suspect that we'll have about 35 minutes of a great discussion, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. And with that, we're going to get going. So I wanted to introduce briefly our panelists. We're fortunate to be joined by Rashad Young. He is the city administrator for the government of DC. Jeff DeWitt, a CFO who has made a big splash since joining us here in the district. Great to have you, Jeff. Matt Klein, president and CEO of Akridge. Kurt Summers, who is a real estate advisor and the former treasurer of the city of Chicago. And finally, but certainly not least, Adam Weirs. He's a principal at Trammell Crow. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to start with a question for all of you, just a really kind of one or two words. During this pandemic, what has surprised you about what you've done either personally or professionally? Is it something health, family, just anything that comes to mind? A lot of people are curious how you guys are spending your time. So we'll start with you, Rashad, on this one.
Great. Thank you, Neil, for the opportunity to be here, and thanks, Peter, for moderating. I think for me, it's just the nature of the change. I mean, you couldn't really imagine, and I think, and certainly in February, think about where we are today, where you go outside with masks, where you're looking to see if you're 6 feet away. Just your entire pattern of engagement and work has changed. In the last 5 years, I've probably been on 6 video conference calls. I probably have 6 a day today. And I think just the last thing I'll say is what I think strikes me the most is, even as we get through this pandemic and COVID-19, the nature of work for us is forever changed. We have probably 15,000 people who are teleworking that are employees of the District of Columbia. And guess what? In many instances, we're still able to do our work. And so I think we're going to be thinking about just how we manage and engage our workforce differently because of this crisis.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think there are a lot of people who would agree with you. Adam, same question for you.
You know, I'll stick on a positive note and say I am surprised by the number of things that were, I would argue, unnecessary that this situation has forced us to let go of. For example, I was not somebody who went, all electronic. I would still print documents out, read them and sign them and mark them all up. And now, honestly, that's archaic and I don't need it. You can sign stuff electronically really quickly and it makes you question all kinds of things like, why do we even notarize stuff? So there is something happening now that is actually change that might be positive and helpful despite all of the chaos and confusion.
And Jeff, what about you?
Well, most of my time has been spent with Rashad as we've been doing the budget the last several weeks, and it'll be with the chairman going forward and the council. But I think the issue has been running the financial operations of the district remotely. I mean, the entire tax office, from income taxes and property tax appeals to all the customer calls and all those types of issues, getting paychecks out and doing that with people doing that from home. It's just running everything, the several, thousand, 35,000 employees, getting those checks out and doing that from in a remote way. We would never have ever thought about a teleworking experiment to this magnitude yet. It's actually been running fairly well. It's been shocking of how we've been able to do that and how people have stepped up. So it's just that that whole, as Rashad said, you do 6 video chats a day, and thank goodness for technology. I don't know how we would have done this 10 years ago. And
yeah,
gotten through this.
And Kurt?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things come to mind. One is it's been interesting to see just how much time you have when you're not commuting and when you're not hopping on a plane, or when you don't have this event to go to every other night, or whatever sort of obligations you thought you had before. It frees up a lot more time and an ability to focus on what's important. And the second thing I would say is I find that I'm more connected to people now than I was pre-COVID-19. People are available, folks are reaching out, and they have been for the last couple of months. And everyone, there's this common sense of we're all going through this together, and people are making space and time for each other. So I feel more connected to people in my life, both personally and professionally.
Well, I appreciate it. And Kurt, are you in Chicago today? Where are you based today?
I am in Chicago.
Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Matt, we're going to flip to you. I'm hoping you might be able to add a little bit, kind of things that have surprised you or impressed you. But second of all, as you exit that question, tell us a little bit about what Akridge is doing, some of the projects that you guys have had in the ground, First Street, Buzzards Point, a little bit. You guys are so active. Where do those projects stand right now?
Sure, thanks, Peter. I think the first answer to the first part of the question is probably 2 ideas that might be in tension. One is I really enjoy being able to see my family over the course of the day, which has been a real great aspect of this work from home component. But at the same token, I really miss my colleagues, right? There is a great tool with these WebExes and the Zoom calls, but there's nothing like being in person. And I miss being back in that environment. Relative to our projects, we've got close to $1 billion worth of projects under construction in the district right now. 3 office projects, one that we completed end of 2019 at 1101 16th Street, 2100 L, which we just hit substantial completion on just recently. And I give kudos to the city team because their inspection and approval process really never missed a beat. And the attitude that we got from the folks at the city were terrific. We've also got a project that we're doing at 17 and Penn. It's a renovation and an expansion. All those office projects, fortunately, have significant leasing and are on pace and doing well. We've got a residential project that we're doing down on Buzzard Point called River Point that will be completed towards the end of this summer, and that's 480 residential units and about 60,000 square feet of retail.
And you feel like a lot of those are going to continue to move forward without interruption?
Yeah, I think that the projects that are in the pipeline that are being built right now are taking extra vigilance to make sure everything stays on track. And as I think Kurt pointed out, the level of collaboration and cooperation that's occurring right now is really amazing. I think we see that often, but it's risen to a new level. So I think the stuff that's in progress right now is going to continue to move forward towards completions and deliveries. I do think that there's going to be a big pause relative to new starts as it relates to people trying to find footing relative to what financing is available, what valuations look like going forward.
We'll get to that in a few minutes. I want to skip over Adam. Can you kind of answer the same question as it relates to Trammell Crow, what you're seeing, and also what your tenants are saying, kind of what you're hearing from your clients and really your staff on the ground?
Sure. So Trammell Crow Company has been active in development in the district since the late 70s. So we've built a lot and have a pretty big footprint across the city. One of the strengths of our current platform is we have a portfolio that's really broad in the range of product types that we're doing. So we develop everything from office to residential, from retail to healthcare. A couple of recent examples of projects we've delivered would include the Shops at Dakota Crossing project in Port Lincoln, where the Costco is, and the Sonnet, which is a multifamily apartment building right next door to the Reed Center. And in terms of future and going forward pipeline, we have a lot of very large projects in the pipeline right now. We recently started construction on our Armature Works deal, which is a very large mixed-use project in Noma, right by Union Market. And I spent a lot of my time working on the McMillan redevelopment, which is a joint venture between Trammell Crow Company, Jair Lynch Real Estate Partners, and EYA. And it is overall a 2 million square foot development, but we are working on just under 1 million square feet of new healthcare, which is right across the street from Washington Hospital Center. In terms of what we're seeing right now, I certainly think the most...
One quick question, just as we go back to McMillan, do you feel, I mean, obviously we've heard a lot about Costco's success during this. How does it feel to have an anchor tenant like that? What are you hearing from them?
Yeah, so, our experience at Shops at Dakota Crossing has been challenging for sure. It's not a good time to be a retail landlord by any stretch, but, it is an interesting thing to be in the middle of a power center that is also home to a Costco and a Lowe's that are doing a level of business that I think is probably exceeding what they've ever done. And, you've been to that Costco, it's a monster. And I think there are more people going in there now than there ever have been. So that does help. And there is some spillover effect for the smaller tenants, but, it's a struggle. And I think all of our tenants that are open, we have a lot of food users and fast casual restaurants. They are definitely seeing significant declines. We're having a lot of conversations about people who are struggling to pay the rent, and we're doing the best we can to partner with people, to work with our lender, and to do everything that we can, because I think I want nothing more than all of my tenants to come out on the other side healthy and able to survive all of this. But, it's a challenge. We have a good plan in place for the short term, but it is hard to figure out what the long-term perspective is here. And I think everybody's going to have to work on that together, and just, hopefully the spirit of partnership stays in place.
Well, that's a great segue. So thank you, Adam, for doing my job. I appreciate it. So this is a question for Jeff and Rashad. You guys have been attached at the hip for the last several months. The budget has been, I can't even imagine what you guys are going through. We're very appreciative that you're here today, knowing the hard work that you guys have been putting in. Tell me a little bit, how, just in general, we'll start with you, Rashad. How would you describe the 2020 budget as it stands today?
Well, let me start back with the process. I mean, I've been in cities all across the country and have been through recessions, as have Jeff. We share war stories sometimes. This has been probably the most challenging process and experience that I've ever gone through in my professional career. To mid-fiscal year, having to cut, $722 million in the middle of the fiscal year is really, really tough. And then Jeff makes me do it all over again, plus some in fiscal year 21 because of the revenue estimate. But I'll tell you, and Jeff and I talk about this all the time, I think compared to many of my colleagues across the country who I talk to, I know Jeff talks to other CFOs, DC is in just an outstanding place comparatively. The fact that we have been so well managed, that we've been conservative in our financial structure, that we've been responsible, has really helped us in fiscal year 2020, which could have been a catastrophic impact in terms of the work that we have to do and people expect us to do, that didn't come to bear. The fact that we had cash reserves that we could use, that we had prior year surpluses, really blunted the impact of what could have been a much more disastrous set of circumstances for the district. Not that this has been easy by any stretch, and we did make very difficult decisions, and there are things that we're not doing that we want to do, but oh my gosh, we could be so much worse off.
Yeah, no doubt. And Jeff, I'd love to hear from you on the same topic.
Yeah, Rashad and I had, 11:30, 1 o'clock in the morning discussions sometimes on, what we could do and what we couldn't do. And I think just to echo everything Rashad said, we ended 19 at a year we hadn't seen since probably 2007. Just a strong year. And you saw a little bit of that in the previous presentation. And what we had just finished, and this is, better lucky than good, as they say, we had just finished having discussions on a recession planning scenarios. If we had a downturn, what tools could we deploy? Use of reserves, refinancings, doing this and doing that. And we literally used every single one of them. And that helped. And we had literally had a workshop with the council at their retreat going over what we would do if there were a recession. And that was February 14th, that we had that recession planning discussion. And we had already thought that through, which helped a lot in terms of dealing with this. But we are very lucky, as Rashad said. I was formerly the CFO of Phoenix, Arizona, when they went through that 50% drop in property taxes, in property values in the Great Recession. And I talked to my colleagues there and throughout the country, all over the large cities in the country. We talk fairly regularly, and their impacts are twice as bad as ours are, at least. And go to Vegas, it's way beyond twice as bad. So yeah, we're fortunate, but it wasn't that easy, and the council has it. And I think we came up with something that is responsible, that gives us, keeps us viable and ready for something that happens next. But I agree with Rashad. It's including what I went through in Phoenix. This is the hardest one.
Well, I find it funny, we hear a lot of this, whatever happens next. Could you do me a favor, Jeff, when we're done with this, and share your crystal ball? Because I know that's the question everybody has and nobody has the answer.
Peter, I get it first.
Exactly. Hey, Kurt, it is great to have you as part of this panel today, because you have a perspective that we don't. And I think a lot of our viewers, we haven't been out, we get our news however we get it, but we don't have the perspective that you do in seeing other markets. You're in Chicago, but you are a real estate investor across the country. What are you hearing and feeling? And knowing DC, where do we stand? How are we doing? Really, how are we doing?
Yeah, let me just start with DC relative to other markets, and just start with the fiscal situation and sort of echo the comments of Jeff and Rashad. I mean, the fact that you have, I'll just put my kind of wonky fiscal hat on for a second. I was a city treasurer. I was a former chief of staff for Cook County through the last recession. And so I've been in those shoes. And I will tell you that when you have a reserve, when you have things like refinancing available to you, when you have a priority from the mayor and from the CFO and the city administrator to maintain your credit rating and to do whatever it takes there, that cannot be understated. The impact that has in terms of the confidence in the market to be a partner to the district and to invest in the district, when you know that they have a sound pension. I think that the best funded pension in the country, and I say that's coming from Chicago, where we have, and Illinois, where we're sort of ranked 49th out of 50 states. In Chicago, our pension funding is we're at about 40 to 45%, depending on the funded status. That sends a message to the marketplace, and it sends a message to investors about what the leadership is doing, what they're prioritizing, whether or not they're stable, and the economy and the tax base is stable, and the support and the infrastructure will be stable. And I think now, when you look at the marketplace in private capital, where I'm an investor and an advisor to Blackstone, the largest real estate investor and the largest private capital provider in the world, to Ullico there in DC, a large union-based insurance company and real estate investor. What they're looking at is, with as a marketplace, we have $1.5 trillion of dry powder capital on the sidelines right now that's not moving. And when they're thinking about markets, about 500 billion of that is just allocated to real estate and infrastructure. These are long-term investments where you have to make assumptions around what the economy is going to do, what the tax base is going to do, what the leadership is going to look like, if it's stable. And I think the structure that you have in DC relative to other markets that don't have the ability to look forward over the next decade, or don't have folks in the fiscal role or the governance role that span political administrations, which you have in DC, I think it's very important, and it sends such an important message around stability, and it will help attract the capital and investment into the district.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think just as a follow-up to that, it can be very brief. Do you foresee the ability for the greater Washington area as a region to leverage that in economic development?
100%. And I'm so glad you talked about the regional context. It's an issue that most municipalities have, that because of the political boundaries of the 10 square miles or whatever your geographic footprint is, there's a competition for corporate relocation, right? There's a competition for real estate investment, and the folks who thrive are the ones who think about this as a region and who commit to a regional approach to attracting investment. And I think that the strength that, if you think about the previous presentation that Jeannette made around the diversification of the industry, you have two strengths there that were in that chart that looked at the different industries. And if you look at that across the DMV, it's even stronger. One is there is significant diversification. It's no longer just Fed USA or Fed Inc., right? And I think that's so important, and it's such an important message to get out there on a regional basis, because that will help the district. The second is, look, you have the largest employer in the world and arguably one of the most stable employers in the world, which helps make the stability argument. So the fact that you can combine the diversification of the industries and the reach, you can do it on a regional basis, and you can have the largest, most stable employer in the world, I think are just, tremendous assets for you to attract capital.
Well, I appreciate that. Rashad, I'm going to probably put my foot in my mouth when I put you on the spot on this a little bit, but we've seen a lot of the regional economic development agencies and corporations band together, I think very effectively. If you look what Northern Virginia is doing, suburban Maryland, and yet DC plays such a critical role. Aside from the denied $750 million, which I'm sure you would love to have if they actually recognized us the way they should. But do you see an opportunity, and Jeff, and then we'll get to the other panelists in a second, to actually invest in economic development and fund it the way that the other municipalities are funding it, so that we can come together equally, I think, and equal footing in the region? Is that something that you foresee being of interest to the government, or even able to fund?
I think for us, the regional context and regional partnership is really important, right? We understand that we're competing not only nationally, but globally. And as Kurt was talking about, people don't understand or know, or particularly care about the fine lines of geography when they're looking about where they want to locate. And so I think the strategy or the conversation for us is, what does regional cooperation and regional partnership look like? Is it an opportunity for us to brand this region collectively to the outside world, to investors, to companies who are looking to locate? Is it an opportunity for us to leverage around workforce development and workforce training, for example? And so I think the question is broader. The answer, I should say, is broader than whether what a specific investment is to a specific given initiative, but more about how we present ourselves to the outside world and do it in a way that really leverages the entirety of the region and all of the assets that we have in the region, and the diversity that we can offer to a bunch of potential suitors that are looking about where they're going to make their next investment decision. And that's how we have to be thinking. That's how our economic development agencies and leaders need to be thinking and be talking to each other about how we present that united front so that we all benefit and that we all win. Because if a project locates in Northern Virginia, then there's opportunities for those workers to live in the District of Columbia and vice versa, and come to our restaurants and come to our downtown, just like our residents will go to Maryland and go to Virginia. And that's the way we have to be thinking about this issue.
And Jeff, is there money?
Peter, if I could.
Sure, go ahead, jump in.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump in on this because I think, and add on to some of Rashad's comments, and also circle back to your question about funding these kinds of opportunities. I would actually argue that an additional thing we could do right now that this crisis is going to allow us to do is think outside the box about how you facilitate economic development. And maybe one of the things that we can do in a context that I think has to be like a public-private partnership, where some of the strength that the district has that can attract the capital that Kurt was talking about can be paired with other forms of currency that the district might have, even in the context of a $700 million budget deficit. That might be things like density that are valuable, that could be added into the mix and used as, a way to facilitate things, but isn't just, your traditional tax abatement or TIF tools. I think that kind of thing has to be a part of this as well. And, the crisis may push us to being more creative.
Hang on to that thought, because we're going to hear from Jeff, but we're going to go right back to you. I've got a question directly related to that. So, Jeff, is there money in the budget to do that?
Everybody talks about the shortfall, but we still have a $7.8 billion capital program over 5-6 years. It could have been $9 billion. You could look at it that way if the economy hadn't cratered, but it's still one of the bigger capital programs. And there's a significant continued investments in Metro as an example. So the funding for Metro continues to get that to a state of good repair, but for that regional cooperation on that, Amazon wouldn't have come here. I mean, that was a big question they had, and I think that regional cooperation is one of the reasons why we're able to get them in, which is an issue there. So there is a significant amount of investment in capital, and we're still on a glide path to get all the district's assets to a state of good repair. Yes, it maybe got slipped back a little bit with this downturn where it was getting ready to accelerate, but we still have one of the only plans in the country to get all our roads, streets, bridges, buildings, all our assets to a state of good repair. So that still continues. It's not like there's no money for capital. There's a significant continued investment in the capital program and infrastructure for the district in this budget going forward.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate it. I know there's a lot of pressure on that budget right now, and I appreciate your candor and forthrightness. So Adam, we're going to go back to you because you decided, and I was hoping that this would come up. So, you have made comments. Today is not the first day. You are not a shrinking violet by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm going to bring up a couple things. And Matt, yeah, exactly. And Matt, you're on the hot seat next. So let's talk a little bit about the height restriction. When we talk about density, when we talk about the ability to go up instead of out, when we talk about the kinds of density we're going to bring in, what's your feeling on that? And is it time to start looking at some of these, you can't touch that kinds of items that are all throughout the city? Can we come together and talk about maybe reducing that height restriction? I want you to frame it in this. Washington Business Journal this morning wrote a story about Montgomery County really loosening the restrictions on commercial development, except in the most unpopulated areas. So there is going to be some additional pressure from the jurisdictions around. So let's get into quickly the height discussion and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I'm definitely a fan. I was a fan pre-COVID of loosening the height restriction. So no shocker there. I absolutely think this is a good idea. And I would put it in the context of thinking about other forms of currency that are valuable things that the district government could bring to help enhance economic development, get projects started, get people back to work, and get more of us paying taxes again, which is, that's a win-win for everybody. And I do think that you can do it in a way that is thoughtful and that can actually help direct resources to other areas that are important policy decisions, like affordable housing. Or, you know, you can do it geographically, right? You could raise the height limit out by the Anacostia River and use the extra money that you create from that to clean up the river. Like, there are a lot of different things that you could do that would be interesting tools. And I wouldn't just stop at the height limit. I would say that we should be looking at really creative projects like what Matt and his team are doing at Union Station, and think about where are the other air rights that we can monetize and turn into land. I think that we should be thinking about federal land acquisition, right? We should go buy RFK and we should build a lot of things out there. I absolutely think that it is time for things that 3 months ago we used to think were hard or not doable. We got to push past a lot of that and figure out how do we use this as a way to get to the kind of recovery that we need.
Hey, Matt, I'd love you to answer this as well, but take it a step further. I mean, you and I have had conversations in the past about the challenge to perform projects effectively from, you know, maybe Class D or Class C office space in the outlying areas and turning those into either affordable housing or other kinds of things. It's just very hard to make that work financially. So if you would talk about the height restriction, but then I'd love for you just to weigh in now where you see some of those grandfather clauses that you've been talking about for so long actually being effective.
Well, I mean, that's a broad question. I'd reinforce the thoughts that Adam put out there in a very thoughtful way, that thinking out of the box is always a good thing, especially in these kind of economic turmoil type periods. I would layer on top of that and Adam qualified it, is we need to do it in a thoughtful way and be geographically targeted. There is an urban aesthetic that we get in DC that comes from the Height Act, right? We get light and air in our streets that is something that is unique to our city. It's a valuable asset for cities like Rome and Paris as well. And that's a valuable asset for downtown Washington and for the city. That said, there's certainly locations. It's kind of crazy to think about Friendship Heights as an example that's got a height limit on one side of Western Avenue that's dramatically different than the other side of Western Avenue. And those are places that warrant that kind of creative thought to be able to try and unlock some value. The conversion discussion is complicated relative to the economics. You know, the highest and best use for real estate in downtown DC, you know, where the bid operates is really office, and multifamily doesn't approach that in this neighborhood. I would say in the Golden Triangle and downtown bid, office is still the driving force for economic value. And even if you were to give free density relative to added height, I don't think you're going to see the economics really pencil for significant amounts of conversion. Obviously, really hard to make broad generalities because there's targeted, you know, examples where these things can work on a project by project basis. That said, I think it can be more effective when you go to areas like the Capitol Riverfront, Buzzard Point, Noma. There are places where the value of residential land and commercial land start to cross over and become more equal.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I want to switch gears just a little bit. I mean, I think one of the concerns, and I'll phrase this way. One of the challenges with the required reduction in the budget was that a lot of the affordable housing had to be eliminated, at least in the short term, which was, I know, an incredibly painful decision, and one that hopefully we'll be able to revisit soon. But there is a concern, I think, among a lot of business people and a lot of community leaders that this will create an even greater wealth disparity in the district. And I'm kind of curious, Rashad, where you see that. Is that something that you're talking about within the government? Is that a concern? And then Kurt, I want to jump to you next and understand how maybe some other jurisdictions are handling it, or if you have any advice for us here in Washington.
Well, it absolutely is a concern. I think probably one of the most difficult decisions that the mayor had to make in crafting this budget is to lessen the investment in affordable housing through the Housing Production Trust Fund and through the Preservation Fund in particular. And she has said that, everybody and everything had to give here in order to make this work. But we really do view this as a short-term scenario. The mayor was insistent, and I worked as hard as I could and was able to make sure that we wouldn't go below $100 million, which is where she started when she first became mayor, raising that fund to $100 million when it would have been, 70 million, 75 million or so in prior years. And so we wouldn't go below 100, but we wanted to do much more. But we do view this as a short-term scenario. DC is going to come back. It's going to be strong. We're going to get through this pandemic in part because we're resilient and we prepared for that resiliency to get through this. And so we're going to be looking for the first opportunity to increase those investments. But we also do have other tools, right? And I think this conversation about density and height is important because those two are tools in the toolbox that will help us with affordable housing. When we start thinking about how to leverage the space and the limited land that we have in the district differently, and while incentives and cash incentives are important, land use has long been a strategic tool to facilitate development in this city and every other city, in urban city across America. And so it's time to have those conversations about how we can use other tools in our toolbox, which we've already started that conversation about how to do that and why that's important. And looking at opportunities where we have very little affordable housing, like Rock Creek East and West, and setting targets in neighborhoods about the kind of development that we want so that we can make sure we're still pushing this equity agenda and that we're still trying to close this disparity gap. And so what we see in the budget in 21 is a reality of the economic condition that we're in, but we are going to move past it and be right back where we were making continued and greater investments in affordable housing because it is absolutely key to our prosperity here in DC.
Well, I know that I've heard the mayor's intention on that very clearly, so I appreciate you adding that. Kurt, let's push to you and see what are you hearing, and then I have a follow-up question as well.
Yeah, what I would say is I fully agree with what Rashad said about thinking about the tools that are available, and I would just also say that this discussion that we're having in this country around equity and around the level of disparity is not a new conversation. It's one that is heightened, I think, rightfully so, in the wake of the pandemic, because we see how these disparities play out. And I think that in regions around the country, whether it's, Chicago, San Francisco, some of this is happening in St. Louis and Atlanta, where you're seeing the common thread of equity across all investments, across every tool, across every conversation. And that's really how you make, that's how leadership shows up in this moment and how leadership shows up to address this issue. You have a $7.8 billion capital program. How are you walking the talk with respect to equity within that capital program? Yes, we're having conversations about new development. Every conversation in new development, no matter where it is in the district or what the historical experience has been. We had an issue here in Chicago where, not dissimilar to other places around the country, where developers often would just effectively pay the fee, right, as opposed to build affordability. And then that affordability would be ported always into the same neighborhoods that would always promote enhanced segregation and more disparity and less equity. And I think that you have the ability to use the tools at your disposal to walk the talk with your own capital, but also to, with respect to each of these conversations, draw the line and say, either we're going to be about equity and we're going to fight against disparity, or we're not. And it's got to be the case everywhere across the region. And because the soonest you are not consistent in that action with either your own capital or with your leadership with other capital, you set the precedent for those allowances, and they'll just sort of continue to creep further and further. And now's not the moment for that.
Well, I appreciate that. We are starting to run short on time, so I have a couple more questions. Jeff, I'm going to move to you. Tell me a little bit about what you see the district's role as we reemerge and recover, not knowing what the full result of both the economic downturn and the pandemic is going to do to our local economy. But tell me a little bit about how you see the district playing a part in that as we get hopefully back to work sooner rather than later.
Well, I think one of the most important issues is for us to come out of this healthy. A strong government can result in a strong economy. And you can see that from what the district was in the mid-90s to what it is today. And so one issue is to make sure we stay fiscally strong and stable to support that. And then when we do that, it gives us opportunity to see where we can help. And I think one thing we have to do, and we're fortunate that we're in the nation's capital, is to work with the federal government to help partner in that category. We can't bail out every failing restaurant and every failing small business. It's just too big. We don't have those resources to do that. So it is finding the places where we can help with our resources and making our prioritizations and where we need to partner with the federal government. But I believe it's being healthy ourselves, and then understanding what's going on in the business community through, and Rashad, we could talk in more detail about this, with economic development agencies and making sure that the human resources are there to help people get through this, because some of it is we have 80-some thousand unemployment insurance claims is helping get through that, but it is using our resources on the human services side, on the economic development side, and understanding what's going on in businesses. But most importantly, as I say to everybody that we talk to, we have to be healthy to help the business community be healthy. And that's what we're trying to do through the budget that is before the council, and that will ultimately go forward.
Jeff, quick question. Do you feel that the council is going to approve that budget?
Look at Rashad's face. I would say, based on this is my 7th budget. And so there will be changes. It will reflect the priority changes that they may have that may differ slightly from the mayor. But I know, and my kudos to the chairman and the mayor, who worked together very closely as this went forward. And there'll be changes, but I think in totality, it will continue to be a responsible budget that we can go to the market and issue $1 billion in bonds in the fall to do infrastructure and do all the refinancings we're going to do over the summer to do that. So there'll be changes. There always are, but they're usually, it doesn't vary that greatly. It's more on the margins of the different priorities of different council members. The mayor would like them to approve it exactly as she hands it to them, but that never comes out exactly the same way, and I respect that. My role is to ensure that whether the mayor's budget or the council changes, that it's fiscally responsible and it can be certified to maintain our high credit rating and do all the things we need to do. So yeah, there'll be changes, but it's generally going to be similar.
And Rashad, we're going to have to leave him wanting more on this question because I have one more question to go through, and then our Q&A, actually 2 questions. So I want to ask this question, and I'm asking you to keep the answers brief. This is an Adam Weir's special, so I'm excited to have this one. If you had $100 million, I'd love to say, and I know, Rashad, you'd love it if I said $750 million, but we'll stick to the $100 million figure. If you had $100 million to invest in the city, how would you invest it? Matt, we're going to start with you.
I guess I can thank both you and Adam for that question, huh?
Yeah.
So I probably look at where the leadership team at the executive branch really feels like the biggest bang for return on investment. Probably housing would be the most obvious choice that would would come to mind. And then whatever we can do to make strategic investments to get our service economy back moving in a productive way. I think obviously we look at what's happened in restaurant and hospitality, and anything we can do to prime that pump, get that machine moving. So I think that's where I focus, is the service economy and housing.
And Jeff, I'm going to ask you this question, although I want you to change your usual way of thinking. You cannot hang on to this money for a rainy day. You got to spend it. You can't pay down debt. You can't, so you have to spend it. With that in mind, what would you do?
I think the issue is how well we recover. I don't disagree with Matt's answer. I mean, my one answer would be to restore the programs that have been cut, because there were programs that were cut. But assuming that we're okay with the budget, I think you need to get to the quickest recovery possible. So my view as a CFO and a finance person and the person who collects the taxes, I want the taxes to come back. And so it's getting those core areas, which is really kind of the hospitality in the area, which is the one the hardest hit, getting that back going as quick as possible. I'm not sure 100 million is enough, but those are areas that I think the quicker we can recover, the better off we're going to be quickly to restore the things that we had to sacrifice on this current budget.
Thank you. Kurt?
Yeah, I agree with both Matt and Jeff that I'd be focused on jobs. And I think the biggest place where I would invest is where, if I'm the government, I'd be focusing on where I could get the greatest leverage for my capital, where my dollar means $3, $4, $5 privately, and where it would immediately have an impact on the tax base. Because I fully agree with Jeff. You can tell we both, come from the same school a little bit here, which is, you can't pour out of an empty cup, right? And so the stronger the fiscal situation, the better the investments can be. And in order to strengthen the fiscal situations, you need to make investments in the economy that pour into the tax base naturally.
Rashad, what about you?
I love to hear all these answers, because as the person who has to put the budget together, it's good to hear what other people's priorities are.
Yeah, I figured that would be helpful. You can buy me a beer later, but
housing number one, workforce number two. We cannot say enough about the importance of affordable housing at various income levels across the district, and the need for that for people of all economic strata to be able to be here and participate in the prosperity of the district. And workforce, certainly in those economies that really drive our economy and drive those tax revenues that Jeff collects and I need to deliver what everybody expects us to deliver and wants us to deliver. So that service economy, hospitality economy, that workforce, making sure that we can preserve that workforce and get them back fast.
Yeah, we got to bounce back as quickly as we can. I agree. Adam, since this was your brainchild, I'm going to have you answer last, and then we'll get into Q&A.
I appreciate that, and I'll do my best to finish with a flourish. So I'll invest my $100 million inside of the bounds of the downtown bid, just to get fancy. And I'll put together a proposal to give to Rashad and Jeff that I will buy the convention center from them for $100 million. And in fact, I don't actually want to operate the convention center, so we can get a little fancy here. We'll do a sale leaseback, right? So I'll buy it from you. We'll do a lease for like 100 years.
100 years or something perfect.
I'll charge you like $1, so you can have it back in a century, right? And what I want in exchange, I want you to use some or maybe all of that $100 million, and I want you to reconfigure the convention center, make it a little smaller. We'll just take away some of the parts that are above ground, because there's a lot below ground, right? And it's a big building, so we'll make it a little smaller. We'll put a cap on it, and then we'll give me a nice little plot of land that I can build on. And what I really want here is 3 to 4 million square feet of density. You give me that, I'll give you $100 million. We got a deal.
I think you're lowballing, but that's okay. because that's a real offer, so you got to go low first. I get it.
All
All right.
a few billion we can talk.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to Q&A, but while we're doing that, a quick question for all of you, which is COVID-19. Are you thinner, fatter, or the same? And then I'll ask my Q&A questions.
Thinner.
Thinner, I like it. Who else? Thinner, fatter? Jeff?
Probably a bit thinner, but need to go a lot more. So
Matt?
Same.
Adam?
Same, but my left hook is weaker because I haven't been in the gym.
I like that. Rashad?
Oh, I'm thinner.
Kurt?
And they're trending the right direction.
I like that. Well, at least that's a good thing. I think, that's a sweet way to end this. So I want to go to some Q&A that we did get earlier. We've had quite a few questions, and I'm appreciative that everyone has stuck around. We're going to spend about 5 or 6 minutes. Rashad, this one is for you. When do you think, I know that the Franklin Park renovation was underway scheduled. Do you know when that's going to get going again? We have had a question on that.
Yeah, we think we were hoping for April of 2020. So I expect that to be this summer that we can be underway with Franklin Park.
And Jeff, I don't know if this is for you. Does the district actually have a plan in place as far as social distancing and getting back to work? Are there specific things that people should be prepared for?
Well, I sit on the Reopen DC committee with, I know some other people that are on this call, and there is in the plan. There's a reopen plan for the district government, and it includes mask and social distancing and limited capacity. And in phase 1, we're in now, or we'll be in tomorrow, I guess. And phase 2, telework is still highly recommended. It's really not until phase 3 that you get to coming back. But yes, and you can see it on Reopen DC and the coronavirusdc.gov. You can see the actual plan and how many. I saw questions about number of people in a crowd and what people can do in restaurants, and when that all opens up, it's all laid out very explicitly in that report, which was very proud to be a part of and putting together. I think it's a very good document.
And is there any update on schools, especially elementary schools?
I'll take that one. The DCPS is fielding a survey now to really try to understand what families want. There are some options for coming back in August that will absolutely include social distancing, but there could be some alternative schedules for young people where they're both doing learning from home and in class, because we've got to maintain, we have to think about separation in a different way. Which means reducing the number of people that typically would come into school. This summer, we're going to be doing virtual summer school while we're in phase 1. And so students who need that additional attention and work will be able to do that. There is some thought about some in-person learning as we hopefully move into phase 2 later this summer.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Matt, what are you hearing from your clients? There's a question about kind of what you think restaurants are going to do. Is it going to be jurisdictional? How are the building owners, investors, management companies going to work with their tenants to ensure that there is a plan and they're following it? Just kind of curiously what you've heard and what you're thinking.
Sure. So we've been working, our operations and property management teams have been working tirelessly over the last 2 months just to prepare for getting back to work in a way that aligns with the Reopen DC plan. And we've held virtual town halls. We've done all of the programming and planning relative to our own physical facilities, relative to wayfinding and directional signage and all the things that come with that. I think everybody's, and I would say from an owner and a client and a retail user standpoint, everyone has been super cooperative, right? We've really seen everybody trying to get relief to the places that need relief and thoughtful planning to those that are looking for how they get back to the office. I would say, Peter, and maybe this is the opportunity, it is, Reopen DC plan is a remarkable plan. I think one of our greatest assets in getting back to normal or getting back to a recovery mode is the leadership that we've had in the city. We've seen it. Obviously, we have Jeff and Rashad here, but between the mayor and the chairman, mayor in particular, with the communication and the effort that she's put forth, I think has given a lot of people a lot of comfort and clarity as to the path forward. And I think that's super important.
So it's interesting, you know, we've talked about a few things, kind of these sacred cows that may be slightly controversial, but, you know, one of the things I haven't heard a lot of recently, and it was interesting to watch the governors of Maryland, the governor of Virginia alongside our mayor, really with the same gravitas, the same weight as those regional leaders. And I have not heard the banter for statehood. Is that something that you think might actually percolate again, especially given the way that, you know, there was a big argument before that we were not in a financial position to be able to do that, and yet you look now and you see the footing that we're on. I mean, I think you know, if you look at the city, if you look at, you know, quite frankly, if you have a chance to read the downtown, the future downtown, the report that the downtown bid, kind of the motivation for today's session, you know, it's pretty healthy. We're doing a good job. And so do you see that entering into the conversation, or is that the third rail that I should not even be asking about today?
No, we should be talking about statehood at every opportunity, every chance that we get, because it is so important to just how we are able to operate. I mean, look at this circumstance. I think the lack of 2 senators and a voting member in the House impacted us relative to every other state in the United States in terms of the relief that we got from the federal government. And look at us in DC, self-governing, managing effectively, appropriately, with political leadership and administrative leadership that really is leading this crisis. And I would say better or as well as any other state, and perhaps better than most. And so I think we ought to be talking about the importance of statehood, making this a point, and pointing to this as a real concrete example as to why this matters.
And Kurt, question for you as it relates to this. Does that ever come up in your question? I mean, you went from being, you know, the treasurer of the city of Chicago, and now, you know, you're a real estate investor. You work with a lot of real estate companies. Does that come up when people are saying, hey, we're looking at the greater Washington area?
I think it's known as an open question. It's known as something that's desired. And I think that the point Rashad just made, which is, you know, look, when you're looking at where to invest now and it's not just to be an investor, where you want to be a partner, right, in the long run. Because if you're investing in infrastructure or you're investing in real estate, you're a long-term partner. I mean, you're a part of that, the fabric of that place for as long as you know, you can see in the future. And I think that when you look at right now, municipalities and states and their respective performance through the CARES Act and through you know, what the allocation of funds will be, you know, it's a zero-sum pie, right? In most places, the more of that you get, the less you have to try to raise in tax revenue, or the less you have to raise from expensive capital markets. And I think that all of those things have impact on me if I'm looking to be your partner. So 100%, that conversation, there's zero chance that someone's looking to invest in the DMV and specifically in the district, and they're not wondering what the outcome of that question is going to be.
Matt, does that ever come across, you know, as you guys are looking at some of the outside investors you work with, and you've got a pretty spectacular project on 14th Street, right near the White House right now that you're working on. Does that come up in your conversations at all?
Which in particular, Peter?
Whether or not statehood is an issue for people, or there are any of the levers that get pulled once you have that in your kind of, you know, that tool at your disposal.
I mean, I can't say we've ever had a conversation with an outside capital partner that has said, you know, we would look at investment in a district differently if it was a state or if it wasn't. That doesn't in any way diminish the fact that it seems self-evident to most of us that the district is way past due in getting that recognition from Congress. And the $550 billion that we got shortchanged is a perfect example of why we need that seat at the table. That if you think about it from an investment standpoint, that kind of infusion into the district would have made a significant difference in the budget and the kind of investments that could have been made that would have had real impact on the city as it relates to our investment platform.
So I know that
Peter, if I could just say to that, it also makes a difference to the work that is yet to come. We have spent a significant amount of money in responding to this pandemic, but through the Reopen DC work and all of the planning work that we do every day here, there's a significant amount of work yet to be done. And we need federal resources and investment to be able to recover and reopen the District of Columbia, to support businesses, to support residents. That is a critical part of our ability to move through this in an appropriate way and get us open faster and get this economy moving faster.
So I guess, I had there's been an interesting question. We've had a couple along this line of, and I was not aware, is there a significant increase in crime during the COVID crisis? I haven't seen that, but one of the viewers had said that there was an increase in crime, and what are we doing as a city to address that?
There isn't an increase in crime overall. Unfortunately, our homicides are ahead of where they have been last year, but nearly all other categories of crime have been on the decline. We've seen lower volumes of 911 calls that have come in. We've seen lower volumes of fire and EMS requests, and we've seen overall lower crime. But we've got this very stubborn violent crime and shooting issue that is impacting us still this year, that we're working on fervently, both with MPD, with other community assets to do violence interruption and engagement with the community to really try to abate that issue. So if there's a sore spot on crime, it's really that we want to see more progress on these shootings.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And obviously that I know you guys are working hard. I think it is unfortunate we're seeing that across the country. I think a lot of it just has to do with people being at home as long as they are, unfortunately. Was wondering if generally what you're hearing as far as the companies or organizations that either you manage, the government or private institutions, what your plan is as far as letting people go back to work. There's a question, there's several questions related to whether or not you're going to comply with certain orders, or you're going out on your own, or you're going to see how it goes. So I'm curious from the group here. And then I just wanted to let everyone know the mayor is on her way. She is trying to get here. She is in a very important meeting that she is trying to break away from. So she asked that we all be patient. She's on her way. So
I'll just say from the government's perspective, we're advising people, the community, as we enter into phase one, that most workers should continue to telework, and that except for the allowances that we've made in the phase one reopening for that particular service, that people should stay in a telework or work from home posture. For us as a district government, most of that will continue in phase two. We'll start to bring other things back in phase two, but where we can still have our employees telework, we intend to do that, and that will be the guidance I think that we would offer to the general community as well. Tomorrow, the mayor will be convening her cabinet, and we'll be talking with all of our agency heads for our 35,000 employees, and sort of walking through a very specific guide that we put together about when you return to work, how to do that, how to enforce social distancing, how to think about what kind of physical modifications have to take place in the work environment, who should continue to telework, what to do if you're sick, where to go to get testing. Next week, in anticipation of there just being more movement around, we're going to open up a testing opportunity in downtown, so that as workers start to come back to work and they want to get tested or need to get tested, they can have a very easy place to go. Those are the kinds of things I think that employers, at least that we are thinking about, both for our own workforce and in the guidance that we're giving to the community.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's time. This has been a really wonderful discussion. As Neil had mentioned earlier, this discussion will be recorded. I appreciate everyone's time. And we are very fortunate to be joined by Mayor Bowser. Mayor, thank you very much for being here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the Mayor of Washington, D.C., Mayor Bowser. She, with her team, had produced a balanced budget, not just in the technical sense, but as we've all been talking, I think more importantly, in the fact that we all share in the pain that those decisions had to be made by Mayor Bowser and her team. But I think if you look at some of the work that she's done, I'm not sure we've seen a more dynamic mayor in my recent memory. And some of the things, I mean, it's really hard, but if you look at the general fund investment that we've made throughout the city, and the fact that the percentage of the budget at 3.5% or over almost 16 billion in total investment is unbelievable. The renovation of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library, which was nearly $250 million, the reconstruction of Franklin Park, which we just talked about it, and of course the significant dedicated Metro Rail funding for the district, really demonstrating some significant regionality. And Mayor, thank you very much for being here. I know how busy you are, but we're really thrilled that you were able to take the time and join us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, it's great to see everybody, and I want to thank you for coming together. I came in on the tail end of the city administrator's remarks. I noticed that our CFO, Jeff DeWitt, has also joined the call. And I participate in the State of Downtown every year. And this is a little bit different, but I'm certainly happy to participate. We know how much the Downtown Business Improvement District has been a friend of the District of Columbia. Neil and his leadership are invaluable to us. As a former city administrator and deputy mayor and agency director himself, he knows DC government well, and the synergies between the bid and DC government can be very powerful for the downtown. We also recognize that we had a different kind of budget season. Certainly, we didn't advance the budget that we thought we were going to, and that the CA and budget team had put together a brilliant budget that I thought was very transformative for the district. We soon, before we were to submit it to the council, learned that we would have $700 million fewer to work with. And even with that, we advanced a budget that I'm very proud of, that maintains city services at a high level, invest in schools, which is, in my view, the single biggest driver of the transformation of the District of Columbia, invest in our public spaces, our transportation options, and looks to the future. So we are going to come out of this pandemic, and we will come out on the other end of this, and we will still have a very solid foundation in government operations to build from. We would have still made very significant investments in our people, our greatest resource. And I think we'll be more resilient from a health standpoint, because we're learning a lot and we're making very significant investments in doing that. And having said all of that, we have the opportunity, I think, all of us, to think collectively about the things that we learned that we want to keep, the things on the other end of this pandemic that will allow our city and our region to function better. So this indeed is a time for innovation. And so we're looking to all of our friends in the bid who represent so many different types of employers to help us think about how we're operating, how we're doing business, how we're moving people in the city, how we're educating and training our workforce so that we can be even stronger. I know the city administrator has already talked to you about the work of the DC Reopen Advisory Committee and the set of recommendations that they have delivered to the government. And it's our job now to look through all of those recommendations. And we had the very able leadership of Susan Rice and Michael Chertoff, 11 sector committees. Each of those committees had at least 10 people. They conducted 100 in-depth interviews and even more focus groups to really learn what we needed across those 11 sector committees. Now it's our job to look by phase to implement, to adopt, first of all, those recommendations that we think work for the district, and we will do so by executive order per phase, and to implement those things. What's very important for us, and we believe strongly that the economic comeback of the district cannot happen without a health stabilization and comeback as it relates to this virus. So we are careful in how we will implement turning back on the economy, but we're also very optimistic about it. I guess a few days ago, we released our jobs numbers, our unemployment numbers in the district. And we had been, I guess, about 5%, a little over 5% unemployment in February. And now we're double that, a little 11%. And that's a striking number. It's striking to have 100,000 DC workers applying for unemployment. But when I look at some of my colleagues at other places in the country, other cities and states, they're already over 20% of unemployment. So as much of a challenge as we have, we know that our experience with the virus could have been much worse. And we're committed to addressing it so that we can get people back to work and back to a better than normal. So that continues to be our focus. I just hung up a call with some of my team talking about our transportation network and how we can reimagine that. And certainly the downtown plays a role in that. We continue to be heavily invested in the K Street Transitway, which we will look for your support on as our budget goes through the process. Franklin Park, we've been fighting for a long time, in addition to Franklin School, and we're very proud that all of those things are moving as well. We know that there will be some other opportunities in the downtown with some movements. You know, I don't know how long Metro has been in that building, but in a couple of years, they won't be in that building. So we continue to look for opportunities to invest in our downtown, to celebrate our downtown, and to make sure our downtown is healthy. So I just wanted to be here to let you know that our administration is your partner, and we will look forward to continuing to work with you.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor, for joining us this afternoon. It's good to see you, and thanks for your kind words about the Downtown DC bid. We are always happy to partner with you and your administration and your efforts. Thanks again for your leadership and joining us. I want to thank, in addition to our mayor, our chairman, Phil Mendelson, who gave opening remarks this afternoon, our very capable moderator, Peter Abrams. Peter, you might have to do this again. This was very well done. And then to all of our panelists who gave their time today, thanks so much. And all of you who are attending virtually, thanks as well to the many individuals and organizations and my team, the bid staff, who contributed to the creation of this year's State of Downtown Report. You will receive a link to the recorded roundtable at downtowndc.org. Please share it with your colleagues and friends. And thanks so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks again. Thanks, Mayor.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Neil.